Hello and welcome. I'm Matthew G. Mosman, and this is my human lifespan development presentation focusing on the issue of psychosis. I chose psychosis because it is probably one of my primary interests in the field, and I've always wondered why psychosis and psychotic disorders tend to onset at the time that they do, which is usually, you know, late adolescence, early adulthood. I always conceptualized it that it was this thing that just kind of came out of nowhere, you know, like a cancer. And what is the biological or cognitive change that happens at that time period that makes people vulnerable to this issue? But thinking more about development and about what psychosis is, which essentially it is inability to determine what is real from what is not, I realized that it's not like it's something that is not present before people are older. Children lack the capability to determine what is real from what is fantasy for a significant part of their development. So what we consider to be psychotic is really dependent on our expectation of the individual and where they are in their development. And the lightning bolt for me that made me think about this is the idea of Santa Claus. You know, in America, in like this Western American culture, it's totally normal for a 6-year-old to believe and truly believe that there's like a fat man flying around on a sleigh with a bunch of reindeer who's going to bring them presents. Something that if it was a 30-year-old man who needed to make rent on January 1st, who wrote a letter to Santa Claus on December 10th, and then when he didn't get his rent money on December 25th, became distraught that he had been put on the naughty list, that would be a pretty clear-cut case of psychosis. And so I became curious in where do we define the line? Where do we find that our expectations change, and how does that influence how we diagnose the symptom of psychosis and its related illnesses? So, what is psychosis? Right? Psychosis is a symptom. Some might call it like a grouping of symptoms. It's not an illness in and of itself. It can be associated with a lot of illnesses or associated with activities even. And kind of one of the most important things is that it is an abnormal state of mind, causing an inability to discern what is real from what is not. And that word abnormal is very important because most people probably believe things that aren't true or that aren't scientifically proven. But what sets psychosis apart as a phenomenon of psychopathology is that it is an abnormal state that causes people to not be able to make that determination. And that can mean delusions, like fixed beliefs that are contradicted by evidence, but which people cannot be convinced out of in a normal way, and even sensory phenomena like hallucinations, seeing things, hearing voices, smelling things that aren't there, feeling things that aren't there, like somatic delusions of people touching them or feeling like they're on fire. And these things can happen all on their own, or they can be together, where you have a delusion that's supported by hallucinations, which is something you might see in a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia. And they're most commonly diagnosed in late adolescence through early adulthood, the disorders I'm talking about. A little bit earlier for men, a little bit later for women, but very uncommon that you're going to hear about a child being diagnosed with psychosis or a psychotic disorder. We don't really talk about psychosis in children because, like I said, the ability to determine reality from unreality is not something that we necessarily expect children to have, especially younger children. And just like the idea of Santa Claus, children believe a lot of things. They believe in a lot of fantasies. They have imaginary friends. We don't expect them to have the same grasp on reality that adults do. And so even if they may seem to present in a way that we would describe as psychotic if it was an older person, we're not often going to describe them that way, with a few exceptions, which I'll get into later. So when does Santa Claus stop coming to town? In the interest of kind of seeking out that boundary of when should we start expecting developing humans to be able to tell the difference between fantasy and reality, I sought out this study. It's an older study from 1979, which specifically studied when do children begin to become skeptical or just outright disbelieve in the idea of Santa Claus. It was actually very interesting. The modus operandi behind the people who did this study, it did seem like it was something of a cabal of psychologists in the 1970s who were very opposed to the idea of telling children lies, that something like Santa Claus existed. And they thought that maybe we're doing developmental damage to children by, telling them that Santa Claus exists, only for them to find out later that we lied to them. It seems like they probably did a series of studies on this. This was only one of them. I would love to read the rest, but they're all paywalled, and I only ponied up the $15 to see this one, which I do not regret at all, because it was great data. They had 72 kids in 3 cohorts: preschoolers, first graders, and third graders. And not only did they interview them about whether they believed in Santa Claus or not, they also interviewed them to determine their level of causal thinking using Piaget's questions adapted for their study. So they interviewed people what they thought about Santa Claus and whether he was real, in such a way not as to lead them on, and also asked them questions like, why do you think the clouds move? Why do leaves fall? And a number of others. So they were scoring them on their level of causal thinking as well as their belief or disbelief in Santa Claus. And they were able to show that a vast majority of preschoolers, like age 4 or 5, believe in Santa Claus and obviously had a low level of causal thinking, and that it decreased drastically at first grade and even more drastically by third grade, where the majority of children no longer believed in Santa Claus. But even more interestingly, they were able to correlate this with the causal thinking scores and show that the children who had a higher level of causal thinking were less likely to continue to believe in Santa Claus. And that applied to younger and older children. The younger cohort children, the first graders versus third graders in particular, first graders who had higher causal thinking scores would be perhaps even less likely to believe in Santa Claus than third graders who had the lower end of the scores. So this is really kind of, I feel like, some interesting data that shows us the transition. Piaget would call it the transition between pre-operational and concrete thinking. And it also shows that it's important for us to realize that, age is nothing but a number. And some people are always going to be a little bit more further along than others. But in terms of that ability to discern reality from fantasy, and the cessation of kind of infantile magical thinking, other scientifically proven measures of cognitive development did reliably predict which children were more skeptical of the Santa Claus idea. They also made a note, which I think was really interesting, that they interviewed a few children who had advanced cognitive ability to understand that Santa Claus was impossible, and yet they clung to the belief. And in a way, these may have been some of the most advanced children, because they were almost trying to make like a theological argument of why, the idea of Santa Claus stands outside the rules of physical reality. And this kind of brought me to another aspect of this that I didn't expect, which is that Santa Claus isn't just an example of like something that children believe and that adults would not believe unless they're psychotic, but it's also a cultural phenomenon. And they talked about the fact that cultural influences and reinforcement affect what beliefs people retain and what they discard as they get older. And this really rings true to me. I do believe that our environment and the people around us influence where we apply our newfound critical thinking skills. If your society tells you that something is true, then even if you have the critical thinking skills to maybe question that, a lot of people are not going to be inclined to do so. So just because people acquire critical thinking skills does not mean that they're going to apply those skills towards everything and every belief that they've ever acquired. And this kind of brings us to the idea of like folklore and religion, where people acquire certain beliefs that are held in common by their culture and their society, and no matter how developed they become cognitively, they may never be inclined to question those beliefs or hold them up to the same standards as the rest of reality. And this is very important going forward when we start thinking about what do we as clinicians and mental health providers consider to be psychotic. And at the end here, I mentioned that the Santa belief is really unique in that it's something that's enforced and encouraged to be believed until a certain age, and then afterwards that reinforcement ceases. And so it's not actually as good of a bellwether of whether children are able to discern fantasy from reality as I thought it might have been, because there is that societal interference and that idea that in our society, younger children are encouraged to believe in Santa Claus, and once they reach a certain level of maturity, that reinforcement drops away, and they may even be taken aside and told, hey, Santa Claus doesn't exist if it seems like they're believing in it too long. So we're going to go into some cultural stuff now. So what influence does culture have when we're thinking about psychosis and also human development? We know culture influences people's development and their belief systems. But in terms of psychosis and diagnosing psychosis and psychotic disorders, the most important issue is that in order for us to consider someone to be psychotic, they need to be in an abnormal state of mind that makes it difficult for them to discern between what is real and what is not. And depending on their culture, what is abnormal may vary from person to person. So in diagnosing people from different cultures, we need to take into account what would be considered a typical or normative belief or pattern of behavior in their culture before we jump to the conclusion that whatever is going on with them is abnormal and perhaps psychotic. A big example of this would be religious beliefs, right? Because, if you're a secular counselor like I am, we try and apply the psychosis standard to basically scientific terms. If people believe things that aren't scientifically true, we become skeptical of their state of mind. But, we're a nerd to the idea that, people believe that, Christ died and after 3 days he rose again. We don't believe that this makes someone psychotic. And there's a good reason for this. Even if you're a new atheist like myself, because there's a big difference between whether somebody believes that there's a purple seaweed monster beneath Totten Pond that's going to consume the earth in 10 years and everybody better get ready, versus if you were raised in a community of people that have that belief and it's just kind of part of your culture. If there's one person who believes in that purple seaweed monster and structures their life around it, we're inclined to believe that person has an issue. And that would be probably psychotic, assuming that it's causing them some kind of distress in their functioning. But if you grew up believing that, surrounded by people that believe that, it's not indicative that there's any systemic issue with your thinking. You are not necessarily suffering from any kind of like biological imbalance or anything of that nature that's causing you to think abnormally. It is normal for someone to believe something that they have been raised to believe by their community and by their society, no matter how bizarre that might seem to outsiders who aren't raised in that particular culture. But there is a limit to this. And this last point is kind of my own construction, but I believe that it is valid, which is that we defer to cultural standards until the belief in question causes enough distress, dysfunction, disability, harm, basically, that it's no longer something that we can consider just a cultural quirk. If it's not in baseline with the culture that it comes from. Just like with, the person who, is a Christian might believe that, Christ will rise again and there's going to be end times. Lots of evangelical Christians believe that, Christ is going to return and there's going to be a final battle. But if somebody is saying, well, I think the Antichrist is here and so I'm going to drown my kids in the bathtub, that invalidates our deference to that cultural standard. We're going to identify that as a delusion and a dangerous one, even if it is something that, if they were not acting on it so severely, would be considered a typical belief in their community. All right, so coming back to Santa and the unexpected presents that he's been dropping down my chimney, I may be out of touch with my own childhood, but I didn't expect the data to show children so young already being able to reason their way out of the belief in Santa Claus. But that just raised more questions for me. If children by the age of 7, 8, 9 are able to determine that even a culturally reinforced belief is not true based on being able to critically reason that it is not possible or realistic, then what happens between then and the typical age of onset for psychosis, right? Part of my line of thinking going into this whole project was that, if younger people are not expected to be capable of discerning reality from unreality, then maybe that's an explanation for why we don't see diagnoses of psychotic disorders and psychosis until, late teens, early 20s. But it seems like maybe that's not the case. But as I look into it, it seems like actually it does make a lot of sense. It's not like there are no diagnoses of psychosis in childhood. I did find a study that shows a prevalence of schizophrenia in like the 8 to 10 to 12 year old range. Childhood onset schizophrenia, they call it. I mean, it has a tiny prevalence, 0.002 to 0.004 versus like 1% for the general population, but it does exist. And kind of my own personal digestion of all this is that it's a confluence of a few factors, right? I think, there's a certain amount of credence to the idea of like Piaget's formal operations, that it starts kind of like around 11, maybe a bit earlier for some people, a bit later for others. But formal operations represents to me a real increase in the complexity of cognitive thought. And also just biological brain development really continues to accelerate during this period. And one of the things I've said for many years working in psychotic disorders is that, people become psychotic because, the wires get tangled, and it's hard for that to happen if there's not a lot under the hood. So the more that's under the hood, the more developed and complicated the brain and the cognitive processes happening in the individual, the more likely they are to be susceptible to psychosis. I mean, we have evidence that more intelligent individuals are more likely to be susceptible to psychosis for this very reason. And another thing is that I think that, probably some symptoms of psychosis, maybe people like to call them like prodromal, they do exist in some individuals in, the 13, 14, 15 kind of like intermediary range that I'm thinking about, where it seems like there's this like black hole, but there's a lot of reasons why people don't identify psychosis in these people, even if it's there. And it's because people don't want to diagnose minors with serious mental illness. People like to think that if people have mental health issues while they're still in their developmental period, that they will grow out of them. Maybe some of them do, maybe some of them don't. But it's just not perceived the same way. And also, until late teens, early 20s, most people don't have a whole lot of independence and responsibility to take care of themselves. And I think that even if a lot of the issues associated with like the psychotic disorders like schizophrenia might be there before that time period elapses, it doesn't become not only evident, but it doesn't become something that can't be ignored until people are put into a situation where they actually have to take care of themselves. And so it's not that there's this black hole between the age of reason and the age of onset of psychotic disorders. It's more like there's this age of uncertainty and also kind of like willful ignorance and a lot of misdiagnosis, which I can't blame people for because, prodromal bipolar and schizophrenia look a lot like ADHD and autism and anxiety disorders, and very few practitioners are going to want to saddle somebody at that age with a diagnosis like schizophrenia, which is carries some really heavy stigma with it. And so the puzzle is starting to come together, but we're going to get into a little bit of biology next. So now that we come to biology, just because I saved it for last, I don't want anyone to think that I am playing into this idea that the biological or physical science of neuropsychology is the source of all answers to all questions. But it is a useful kind of end stop for me when we consider this riddle of why do psychotic disorders and the symptom of psychosis tend to manifest, at least for the first time, in this age range of, like late teens or early 20s. The major psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, we know all of them have genetic markers, they have a biological component, and that probably means that the biology of an individual person needs to develop to a certain point for these to manifest. But psychosis is not a phenomenon that is limited just to the big, most recognized psychotic disorders. Psychosis can manifest in an otherwise healthy brain with no genetic markers, sometimes spontaneously, other times because of environmental factors such as trauma, which is often a component in, the etiology of hearing voices or other psychotic issues that may occur in an otherwise not compromised individual, genetically or biologically. But my hypothesis, which I don't have a lot of support for outside of my own experience and everything that I've seen and read, is that psychosis is, in a way, like a twisting of a complex process, the complex process of thought in the human brain, and it requires a sophisticated medium in which to exist for the most part, or at least in most cases. So as children age, their brains grow, they become more sophisticated. The children themselves become more intelligent, and it's intelligence and sophistication on which the disease of psychosis thrives. The more there is in the brain, the more pathways, the more there is to be perverted by this disease. And so children, may occasionally fall afoul to the misfortune of becoming psychotic because of either biological factors or who knows what. But it is young adults whose brains have newly become very sophisticated and intelligent, who usually are the ones who we first identify as being psychotic. And it's usually individuals of a lot of promise. I've worked psychotic disorders for a fair amount of time, and I always like to say, among us, there's no dummies. You become psychotic because your brain is a complex enough system that it was able to, become convoluted enough to become psychotic. So, what's my takeaway from all of this? I would say one of the bigger ones is that there is this kind of contextual sliding scale in place when it comes to dealing with psychosis in a number of ways. I talked about like culture and cultural sensitivity and religion and how it takes um, place there. Like, we don't consider someone psychotic because they believe the same thing as everyone around them until that person takes that belief to such an extreme that it is causing harm to themselves and others. I think that also applies to age, and that is probably the case with these kind of fringe cases of like young children being diagnosed with schizophrenia, or identifying psychosis in young people and children, because in the same way we don't expect children to be able to have the same discernment as older people when it comes to separating what's real from what's not. And we won't treat it as a problem until it is very clearly an issue that's causing harm. Like, we're not going to, treat a child as psychotic because they're talking to an imaginary friend until they report that their imaginary friend is like giving them command auditory hallucinations to strangle their infant sibling or throw themselves down the stairs or something like that. In that case, we have to kind of put aside our usual compunctions about defining that kind of thing as psychotic, because all of a sudden it has become a source of real harm. And in all these cases, we kind of have to measure the positive and negative impacts of any intervention that we might make. And, obviously that goes for any psychological issue. But specifically when we suspect psychosis, we need to keep in mind that intervention is something that is always going to be costly, not only for ourselves, but also for the people that we are interacting with. And I would add that, psychosis is an abnormal state of mind that causes people to have a difficulty separating what's real from what's not. But lots of people have, abnormal perceptions that are benign. And as mental health workers, it is not our mandate to intervene where there is no harm. One of the biggest examples of this would be, I did a training a few years ago with the Hearing Voices Network, and there's lots of people out there who hear voices, and much of the time it is quite benign. And a lot of harm has been done by, trying to medicate and treat people for symptoms that really weren't that problematic. So just because someone believes something that's not true, or they're hearing voices or seeing things, it's the responsibility of the treater, as a person in a position of authority and a person in a position to know, to evaluate whether this is something that is really harmful. Is it not causing disability? Is it causing distress? If it's not, it might not be our place to interfere with that. That's certainly the case with children, but it's also the case with adults. And I think that's as good a point to end on as any. So I hope you enjoyed this. All right, so let the credits roll. I just want to say thank you to Helen Cavassier, Michael J. Labellarte, Mark A. Riddle, N. Gogte, N. Vyas, R. Testa, S. J. Wood, and C. Pantelis for putting their articles online for free. I don't know if they had any say in it or not, but if they did, thank you very much. And as for Prentice, Schmeckel, Milosevic, if you guys are still alive, I hope you enjoy my $15. I know you published this in 1979, so if not, I hope I'm like feeding somebody's estate or something like that. Probably just going to some weird journal fund or something like that. But you know what? I don't regret it. I liked the data. It was an interesting article. And William Crane for the Theories of Development. You know, it was not a bad book. I enjoyed it. I read most of it, after all. It was useful. So thank you all. And that's all, folks.